My name is Donnie Crawford, and at 72 years old, I never thought I would have to outwit my own flesh and blood. The country house my late wife Margaret and I built with our bare hands became the center of a family war I never saw coming. When my son Thomas told me he was planning to sell my home to buy his wife a sports car, something inside me broke. The look in his eyes that day told me everything I needed to know about what our relationship had become. Before I continue with this painful story, if you're watching from home, please hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you'll want to see how this ends. I spent most of my working years as a construction contractor here in Portland. Nothing fancy, just honest work building homes for other families while creating one of my own. Since Margaret passed away 5 years ago after 47 beautiful years together, I've been living alone in our modest suburban ranch house. It's comfortable enough, with 3 bedrooms, a small yard, and neighbors who check in on me from time to time. But my heart has always remained with our country house. 45 years ago, Margaret and I were young, ambitious, and crazy in love. We scraped together every penny we had saved and bought 15 acres of the most beautiful land you could imagine, about 2 hours outside Portland in rural Oregon. The property had an old barn, a small creek running through it, and views of rolling hills that seemed to stretch forever. Back then, the land was all we could afford. The house itself came later, built by our own hands over the course of 7 years. I can still remember the weekends and vacation days we spent out there, Margaret holding boards steady while I hammered them into place. I taught her how to lay tile in the kitchen, and she taught me patience when I would get frustrated with the plumbing. Each beam in that ceiling was hand-selected and carefully placed. The stone fireplace took me an entire summer to complete. With rocks we gathered from the creek bed, Margaret chose every paint color, every light fixture, and planted every tree in the orchard behind the house. That kitchen was where Margaret taught me how to cook after she got sick the first time, back when we were in our 50s. "You need to know how to feed yourself properly if something happens to me," she insisted. I remember laughing it off, telling her nothing would happen, but I learned anyway. Thank God I did. The garden out back produced the best tomatoes in the county, according to the local fair where Margaret won blue ribbons 3 years running. To most people, it might just look like a 3-bedroom country house with a wraparound porch and a detached garage. But to me, it was the physical manifestation of our love story. Every nail, every board, every window held memories. It wasn't just property to me. It was my legacy. Thomas, our son, was born a few years after we bought the land. He spent his childhood summers running through those fields, helping his mother in the garden, and learning carpentry from me. Back then, he seemed to love the place as much as we did. His sister Laura came along 3 years later, and she was the same way. Those were golden days, watching our children grow up in a place built with so much love. Something changed in Thomas after he went away to college. He started talking about investments and property values. The simple things that once made him happy didn't seem to interest him anymore. When he met Jessica during his final year of business school, the transformation accelerated. Jessica came from money, lots of it. Her father was an investment banker, her mother from old East Coast money. She had expectations about lifestyle that Thomas became determined to meet. Don't get me wrong, Jessica has always been polite to my face. She calls me Mr. Crawford, despite my insistence on Donnie, sends appropriate birthday and Christmas cards, and makes appearances at family gatherings. But in the 20 years they've been married, I've never felt she saw me as anything more than an obligation, a relic from Thomas's less sophisticated past. Laura took a different path. She became a teacher, moved to North Carolina for a job, and married a kind man who works as a park ranger. They don't have much money, but they call me twice a week and visit when they can. Laura never forgot where she came from. 6 months ago, I had a minor heart attack. Nothing too serious, the doctors assured me, but enough to put fear into Thomas's eyes when he visited me in the hospital. At first, I thought it was genuine concern. Now I realize it was the beginning of his campaign. "Dad, we need to start planning for your future," he said, sitting beside my hospital bed. "My future looks just fine from here," I replied, trying to make light of it. "I'm serious. That big house sitting empty most of the time, the maintenance costs, the property taxes. It's a lot for someone your age to manage. I brushed him off, changing the subject to his kids. My grandchildren, Ashley and Michael, 15 and 12. Good kids who unfortunately see their grandfather less than I would like. But Thomas kept bringing up downsizing and retirement planning in the months that followed, each suggestion more pointed than the last. Through all this, my neighbor Frank remained my closest confidant. Frank Watson bought the property adjacent to ours 30 years ago, and we've been friends ever since. A retired sheriff's deputy, Frank keeps an eye on my country place when I'm not there, which has been more often since Margaret passed. It's a 2-hour drive each way, and sometimes these old bones don't cooperate like they used to. Frank and his wife Judy have dinner with me whenever I visit, sharing news about local happenings and watching out for any problems. "That son of yours was out here again," Frank mentioned during one of my visits last spring. "Brought some fellow in a fancy suit. They were walking the property line, taking pictures. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Maybe Thomas was just showing his friend our family place. I should have known better." It was a Sunday in early June when everything came to a head. Thomas had called earlier in the week, asking if he and Jessica could come over for dinner. This wasn't entirely unusual, though their visits had become more frequent since my hospital stay. I made pot roast, one of the recipes Margaret had insisted I perfect. The table was set, the house was clean, and I was genuinely looking forward to seeing them. They arrived right on time. Thomas in what he calls casual clothes, but still looking like he stepped out of a catalog. Jessica with her perfect hair and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "The house smells wonderful, Mr. Crawford," Jessica said, handing me a bottle of wine that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. "Thanks for having us, Dad," Thomas added, giving me one of those quick hugs that feels more like a business transaction than affection. Dinner started pleasantly enough. We talked about the grandkids, about Thomas's work at the investment firm, about the weather, but I could feel something brewing, a tension in the air that made my pot roast sit heavy in my stomach. After I served coffee and the apple pie I'd picked up from the local bakery, Thomas cleared his throat and exchanged a look with Jessica. "Dad, we wanted to talk to you about something important," he began, his voice taking on that smooth, practiced tone he uses with clients. "Jessica and I have been discussing your situation, and we think we've found a solution that will help secure your future." "My situation?" I asked, setting down my coffee cup. I wasn't aware I had a situation that needed solving. Thomas smiled tightly. "Your retirement planning, Dad. We're concerned about your assets being tied up in property that's not generating any income for you." "You mean the country house?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Exactly," Thomas nodded, looking relieved that I'd caught on so quickly. "It's sitting empty most of the time, costing you money in taxes and maintenance. It doesn't make financial sense to keep it." I felt my heart begin to pound harder. "That house isn't about financial sense, Thomas. It's about family heritage. Your mother and I built it ourselves. You grew up there, Dad." Thomas leaned forward, his voice taking on a patronizing tone that made my skin crawl. "I've actually already been talking to someone who's interested in the property. A developer who sees the potential. He's willing to make a very generous offer." "A developer?" The words felt like rocks in my mouth. "To do what with it?" Thomas waved his hand dismissively. "The house itself is outdated, so they'd probably tear it down. But the land is perfect for a small subdivision. Think about it. 10 or 12 luxury homes where there's currently just one. It's a smart use of the space." I stared at my son, this stranger wearing Thomas's face. "You've been showing my house to developers without my knowledge or consent?" Jessica shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but Thomas didn't flinch. "I was just exploring options, Dad. You hardly use the place anymore. It's practically abandoned." "I was there 3 weeks ago," I said, my voice rising. "Frank and Judy had me over for dinner. We watched the sunset from the porch. Once every few months isn't using it, Dad. It's checking on an investment that could be liquidated to improve your quality of life." I stood up, unable to remain seated any longer. "That house is not for sale. Not now, not ever. Your mother and I plan to keep it in the family. For you and Laura, for the grandkids. Thomas's face darkened. This isn't about some sentimental notion of family property, Dad. This is about practical financial planning. That house is worth over $700,000 in today's market. I don't care if it's worth $7 million, I shot back. It's not for sale. That's when Jessica spoke up. Her voice honey-sweet, but her eyes calculating. Mr. Crawford, we're only thinking of what's best for you. That money could pay for premium care if you ever needed it. And the timing is really perfect because Thomas cut her off with a sharp look, but the damage was done. I may be old, but I'm not stupid. Perfect timing for what? I demanded. The room fell silent. Thomas sighed, then straightened his shoulders. Jessica and I are coming up on our 20th anniversary. I've been saving for something special. The house money isn't for me at all, is it? I asked quietly. What is it you're planning to buy, Thomas? Jessica couldn't contain herself. Thomas found the most amazing car, a limited edition convertible. We've talked about getting one for years, and there's finally one available. But it costs nearly as much as my house is worth. I finished for her, the pieces falling into place. Thomas's expression hardened. Dad, be reasonable. You're almost 73 years old. That house is going to become a burden, if it isn't already. You need to think practically. Get out, I said quietly. What? Thomas looked genuinely shocked. I said, get out of my house. Now. My hands were shaking, but my voice was steady. Thomas stood, his face flushing with anger. Stop being selfish, old man. You're so old you won't have time to enjoy the money from the sale anyway. We're trying to help you. Jessica tugged at his arm, embarrassed but not contradicting him. As they gathered their things, Thomas turned back, his voice cold. You need to think about this, Dad. I'll call you in a few days when you've calmed down. After they left, I sat alone in my dining room, the remains of our dinner still on the table. The house felt emptier than it had in all the years since Margaret died. I couldn't stop hearing Thomas's words, couldn't stop seeing the coldness in his eyes as he called me selfish. My own son. I called Laura that night, needing to hear a friendly voice. When I told her what had happened, her outrage was immediate and comforting. He said, "What to you?" "Oh my God, Dad, I'm so sorry. That's horrible." I don't understand how he could even think of selling the house, I told her, my voice breaking despite my best efforts. He knows what it means to us, to your mother. Laura was quiet for a moment. "Dad, there's something you should know. Thomas has been having money problems. Jessica's spending has put them in a tight spot, and I think they remortgaged their house last year." "How do you know this?" I asked, surprised. "He called me asking for a loan 6 months ago. I didn't have what he needed, and he made me promise not to tell you. But after what he just pulled, all bets are off." I barely slept that night, lying awake thinking about my son, the little boy who used to follow me around with his toy hammer, now a man who saw his heritage as nothing more than a payday. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. The next morning, I got in my car and drove out to the country house. I needed to see it, to touch the walls we had built, to remind myself that the memories were real even if my son had forgotten them. The house looked just as it always did, welcoming and solid, standing proud against the backdrop of Oregon hills. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, breathing in the familiar scent of wood and memories. Margaret's quilt still hung on the wall in the living room. The dining table where we'd shared countless meals still stood by the window overlooking the back garden. I ran my hand along the kitchen countertop that Margaret and I had installed together, remembering how we'd argued about the color before finally agreeing on the warm butcher block. Every corner of this house held a piece of our story. Frank came over around noon, having spotted my car in the driveway. "Thought that was you," he said, accepting the cup of coffee I offered him. "Everything okay? You don't usually come out midweek." I told him about Thomas's visit, about the developer, about the sports car. Frank's face grew darker with each detail. "That's not the half of it, Donnie," he said when I finished. "Thomas has been out here with different people at least 4 times in the past month. One fellow looked like a real estate agent, had a clipboard and everything. They walked all over the property." My stomach twisted. How could he do that? He doesn't own this place. He told Mrs. Abernathy at the general store that he was helping his elderly father sell the property. because you weren't able to handle the details anymore. Frank looked apologetic for delivering this news. He told people I'm incompetent. The betrayal cut even deeper. Not in those exact words, but he implied you were having memory problems, getting confused about financial matters. Said he had power of attorney. That was the moment anger replaced hurt in my heart. I need to talk to a lawyer, I said. The next day, I met with Harold Green, an attorney who had helped me with Margaret's estate. Harold confirmed what I already suspected. Thomas had no legal right to sell my house. I was the sole owner, of sound mind, and in full control of my assets. But, Harold warned, if he's telling people you're mentally declining, he could try to petition for guardianship. It wouldn't succeed if you're clearly competent, but it could create a legal mess that would take time and money to resolve. Can I protect myself from that, I asked. Get a current assessment from your doctor confirming your cognitive health, and maybe consider what your long-term plans for the property actually are. If you do want to sell eventually, doing it on your own terms might be better than waiting for a family fight to escalate. I left Harold's office with a lot to think about. The idea of selling the house felt like a betrayal of Margaret, of our life together. But the thought of Thomas taking control, of bulldozers tearing down the walls we had built, was unbearable. Over the next few days, a plan began to form in my mind. If the house had to be sold, it would be on my terms, to someone who would appreciate it, not destroy it. And Thomas would not see a penny of the proceeds. I began researching potential buyers privately, avoiding real estate agents who might know Thomas through his business connections. I wanted someone who would love the house for what it was, not for the land it sat on. It was Frank who introduced me to Eleanor Wilson. A widow in her early 60s, Eleanor had recently sold her gallery in Seattle after her husband's passing and was looking for a country property where she could start a small art school. She's a good soul, Frank told me. Lost her husband to cancer last year. She's an artist herself, teaches painting. She mentioned wanting a place with character, somewhere quiet to start over. When Eleanor came to see the house, I knew immediately she was the right person. She ran her hand over the wooden banister I had carved, admired the way the afternoon light filtered through the windows Margaret had insisted on making larger than the original plans. This place has been loved, she said simply, standing in the middle of the living room. You can feel it in every corner. I told her about building it with Margaret, about our dreams for the property, about my son's plans to sell it to developers. That would be a crime, she said fiercely. Houses like this should be preserved, cherished. When she outlined her vision for the property, an art retreat where she would live full-time and host small groups of students, I felt something loosen in my chest. This was someone who would care for our home, who would add to its story rather than ending it. I couldn't bear to see it torn down, I admitted. If I have to sell it, I want it to go to someone who sees its value beyond the land. I do, Eleanor assured me, and I would be honored to be its caretaker. We agreed on a fair price, slightly below market value but more than fair, given the private nature of the sale and Eleanor's commitment to preserving the house. Frank recommended his nephew, a real estate attorney who could handle the paperwork discreetly. As my plan took shape, I decided the majority of the proceeds would go into a trust for my grandchildren's education. Thomas would have no access to it. A smaller portion would fund some modest renovations to my suburban home, making it more comfortable for my aging bones. The rest would be set aside for medical expenses if needed. It felt both liberating and heartbreaking to take this step. I was protecting Margaret's legacy from destruction, but also saying goodbye to the home we had built together. Yet each time I pictured Thomas and Jessica spending the money on a sports car while bulldozers leveled our home, my resolve strengthened. The next 3 weeks were a whirlwind of quiet activity. I made several trips to the country house, sorting through decades of accumulated possessions. Some things I moved to my Portland home, unable to part with them. Family photographs, Margaret's jewelry box, the small wooden horse I had carved for Thomas when he was 5. Other items I knew I could let go, knowing Eleanor would appreciate the character they added to the house. Each visit felt like a farewell tour. I sat on the porch swing one last time, watching the sunset as Margaret and I had done countless evenings. I walked through the orchard, touching the trees we had planted together, now tall and strong. I stood in the kitchen where she had taught me to cook, memorizing the way the light fell across the countertops in the afternoon. Eleanor joined me on several occasions, respectful of my process but eager to share her plans. She wanted to convert the old barn into a studio space. The spare bedrooms would host visiting artists. The large garden would be maintained and expanded, perhaps adding a sculpture garden among the trees. "I want you to know you'll always be welcome here," she told me. "This will still be your home in a way, just shared with others who will appreciate it." Her kindness made the process easier, though no less painful. Frank helped me move the larger items, understanding the emotional weight of each piece of furniture, each box of memories. The legal work proceeded smoothly. Eleanor's finances were in perfect order, and she was able to make a cash offer with funds from the sale of her Seattle gallery. My lawyer ensured all the paperwork was properly filed, the deed transferred, and the sale recorded with the county. We completed the transaction without using a traditional real estate agent, keeping it as private as possible. The day I handed Eleanor the keys was both an ending and a beginning. We stood in the driveway, the autumn sun warm on our faces. "I promise I'll take good care of it," she said, emotion thick in her voice, "and I'll honor the love that built it." I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. That's all I can ask for. Frank and I worked out a signal system. He would continue to keep an eye on the property as he always had, but now with the added purpose of alerting me if Thomas showed up. Eleanor agreed to maintain the exterior exactly as it had been, not making any visible changes that might tip off Thomas during his occasional drive-bys. Back in Portland, I contacted a trust attorney recommended by Harold. Together, we established the educational trust for Ashley and Michael. The terms were clear. The money could only be used for educational expenses, and Thomas would have no control over the funds. When the children turned 25, they would gain full access to whatever remained. I hoped by then they would have developed the maturity their father lacked. With a portion of the remaining funds, I hired a contractor to make some improvements to my suburban home. A walk-in shower replaced the tub that had become difficult to navigate. The kitchen was updated with easier-to-reach cabinets. The back patio was expanded and covered, giving me a pleasant outdoor space for the warmer months. Throughout this time, Thomas called several times, his tone oscillating between conciliatory and pressuring. "Dad, I'm sorry if I upset you. I just want what's best for you. The developer is still interested. He's willing to go up another $50,000. Have you thought more about what we discussed? The market won't stay this hot forever." I kept my responses vague, non-committal. "I'm still thinking about it. We'll talk about it soon. I'm not ready to make any decisions yet." Each call left me anxious but more determined. Laura continued to check in daily, supportive but worried about the eventual fallout. "He's going to be furious, Dad," she warned during one of our calls. "Are you prepared for that?" "I'm not doing this to hurt him," I explained. "I'm doing it to protect what your mother and I built, and to ensure something good comes from it." "I know that," Laura assured me, "but Thomas won't see it that way." I knew she was right. Thomas would see only the betrayal, not understanding that he had betrayed me first by planning to destroy something precious for a fleeting material possession. 3 weeks after the sale was completed, Thomas called with news that made my heart race. "Dad, good news. My buyer wants to see the property this weekend. We can take a drive out there together, show him around. If he likes what he sees, we could have an offer by Monday." "This weekend?" I repeated, stalling for time. "That's pretty sudden." "It's perfect timing," Thomas insisted, excitement in his voice. "Jessica and I can pick you up Saturday morning. We'll make a day of it." I took a deep breath. "Let me think about it and call you back." I called Frank immediately after hanging up. "Thomas is planning to bring his buyer out this Saturday. It's time." "What do you want me to do?" Frank asked. "Just keep an eye out. Let me know when they arrive. I'll handle the rest." The waiting was the hardest part. For the next 2 days, I barely slept, rehearsing in my mind how the confrontation might go, steeling myself for my son's anger. I reminded myself repeatedly that I had done nothing wrong legally or morally. The house was mine to sell, and I had sold it to someone who would cherish it rather than destroy it. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear. I waited by the phone, knowing it was only a matter of time before Frank called. Around 11, my cell phone rang. "They just pulled up," Frank reported. "Thomas, Jessica, and another man in a suit." Thomas tried his key in the front door, found it didn't work, and used the spare from under the flower pot. "Thanks, Frank," I said, my heart pounding. "Here we go." I waited 5 more minutes, giving them time to enter the house and discover the changes. Then I dialed Eleanor's number as we had arranged. Eleanor answered on the first ring. "They're here," she said quietly. "Thomas seems very confused. He's asking Jessica if they came to the right house." "Put 'em on speakerphone," I instructed, my heart pounding. I heard Eleanor's voice, calm and clear. "Excuse me, can I help you?" Then Thomas's voice, confused and increasingly angry. "Who are you? What are you doing in my father's house?" "I'm Eleanor Wilson," she replied evenly. "And this is my house. I purchased it 3 weeks ago." "That's impossible," Thomas snapped. "This house belongs to my father, Donnie Crawford." "It did," Eleanor agreed. "But not anymore. I have the deed right here if you'd like to see it." There was a moment of stunned silence. Then Thomas's voice again, louder now. "This is some kind of mistake, or a scam. My father would never sell this place without telling me." "Your father is on the phone right now," Eleanor said. "Perhaps you'd like to speak with him?" I took a deep breath. "Hello, Thomas." "Dad?" His voice was a mixture of confusion and dawning rage. "What the hell is going on? Did you sell the house?" "Yes, I did," I said, working to keep my voice steady. "To someone who will appreciate it and preserve it, not tear it down for a sports car." "You had no right," Thomas shouted, his voice cracking with anger. "We were in the middle of negotiations." "No, son. You were in the middle of negotiations. I never agreed to sell the house to your developer." I heard muffled voices, then the sound of footsteps. The buyer had apparently decided to make a discreet exit from the family drama unfolding before him. "Mr. Jacobson." "Wait," Jessica called, but the sound of a car door slamming suggested he was already leaving. "How could you do this behind my back?" Thomas demanded, his attention returning to me. "Where's the money? How much did you get?" "The house sold for fair market value," I replied, not taking his bait about the exact amount. "And the money is none of your concern." "None of my concern?" Thomas's voice rose higher. "That was my inheritance you just sold. My children's inheritance. The money is in a trust for Ashley and Michael's education," I informed him. "They'll have access to it when they're ready for college. The rest went into making my home more comfortable for my remaining years." "A trust?" Thomas sputtered. "What about Jessica and me? We had plans for that money." "Yes, a sports car, I believe. Forgive me if I wasn't eager to see my home bulldozed for your anniversary present." Jessica's voice cut in, shrill with panic. "Thomas, what are we going to tell my parents? They already congratulated us on the car." "Stay out of this, Jessica," Thomas snapped. The argument between them escalated, revealing cracks in their relationship I hadn't fully appreciated before. Jessica mentioned loans from her parents. Thomas countered with complaints about her spending. It was uncomfortable to hear, even through a phone connection. "We're facing bankruptcy, Dad," Thomas finally shouted, his voice breaking. "The car was just a cover story. We need that money to pay off debts. Jessica's spending has us underwater, on 2 mortgages and 3 credit cards." The admission hung in the air. I hadn't known things were that dire, though Laura had hinted at financial troubles. Still, their poor decisions weren't my responsibility to fix, especially not at the cost of the home Margaret and I had built. "I'm sorry you're in financial trouble," I said finally, "but destroying my home wouldn't have been the right solution." "This isn't over," Thomas threatened, his voice cold now. "I'll fight this. You'll see. You can't just sell family property without consulting the family." "Actually, he can," Eleanor interjected calmly. "The sale was completely legal. I have the documentation if you'd like to review it." "Stay out of this, lady," Thomas snarled. "You have no idea what you've stepped into." "Thomas," I raised my voice for the first time. "You will not speak to Eleanor that way. She bought the house in good faith. Your quarrel is with me, not her." There was a tense silence. Then the sound of Jessica crying softly. "We're leaving," Thomas said finally. "But this conversation isn't over, Dad." Not by a long shot. I heard the front door slam. Then Eleanor's soft sigh. "Are you all right?" I asked her. "I'm fine," she assured me. "They're driving away now. Frank is still watching from his property." "I'm sorry you had to witness that," I told her, feeling suddenly exhausted. "Don't be," Eleanor replied gently. "Families are complicated. I understand that better than most." After we hung up, I sat in my living room feeling emotionally drained. The confrontation had gone much as I'd expected, and yet the raw pain in Thomas's voice, beneath the anger and entitlement, had shaken me. He was still my son, despite everything. I had protected Margaret's legacy, but at what cost to our family? I wasn't surprised when Harold called me the following Tuesday to inform me that Thomas had contacted his office. "He's demanding the sale be invalidated," Harold explained. "Claims you weren't of sound mind, and that he should have been consulted as your next of kin." "What did you tell him?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "That the sale was completely legal. You were assessed as fully competent, and as you're not incapacitated or under any guardianship, there was no requirement to consult your adult children." Thomas didn't accept defeat easily. Within a week, he had hired his own lawyer and filed a petition claiming I had been manipulated and was showing signs of dementia. It was as painful as it was baseless. The accusations triggered a cascade of family drama. My brother in Arizona called, confused and concerned. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years reached out, wondering what was happening. Margaret's sister Evelyn was particularly upset, caught between her loyalty to me and her concern that perhaps Thomas might be right about my mental state. Laura flew in from North Carolina, taking emergency leave from her teaching job to support me. She arrived at my door with a suitcase and a fierce determination to defend me. "This is outrageous," she fumed after reading the legal papers Thomas had filed. "How dare he claim you're incompetent just because you didn't do what he wanted?" Her support was invaluable as we navigated the legal challenge. My doctor provided a thorough cognitive assessment, definitively putting to rest any claims of mental decline. Harold gathered documentation of the sale, proving every step had been proper and legal. Meanwhile, the truth about Thomas's financial situation began to emerge. Laura discovered through mutual friends that Thomas had lost a significant amount in bad investments the previous year. Jessica's shopping addiction had compounded their problems, with credit card debt exceeding $100,000. Their beautiful home in the West Hills of Portland was mortgaged to the hilt, and they had taken a second mortgage to cover margin calls on Thomas's investment losses. "They're drowning, Dad," Laura told me one evening as we sat on my newly renovated patio. "But that doesn't excuse what Thomas tried to do, or what he's doing now." Thomas's increasingly desperate attempts to access the house money turned from legal channels to personal pressure. He showed up at my door, unannounced one evening, Jessica's parents in tow. Jessica's father, Richard Thornton, was every bit the imposing investment banker I had imagined. Tall, silver-haired, with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. Her mother, Barbara, was equally intimidating in her perfectly tailored outfit and calculating gaze. "Mr. Crawford," Richard began once they were seated in my living room, "I think we need to discuss this family situation like reasonable adults." "I'm always open to reasonable discussion," I replied, grateful that Laura was beside me. "Thomas tells us you've sold the family country property without consulting him and placed the proceeds in a trust that he cannot access despite their current financial needs." "That's correct," I acknowledged, though I would add that Thomas planned to sell that same property without my consent to buy a sports car, at least according to what he told me. Thomas flushed red. "That wasn't the whole truth, Dad. We needed the money to pay off debts. Either way," I pointed out, "you were planning to sell my property without my permission. I simply sold my own property of my own free will." Richard leaned forward. "The issue here is family obligation, Mr. Crawford. Thomas and Jessica are in a difficult financial position. As parents, it's our duty to help our children when they're in need." Laura couldn't contain herself. "With all due respect, Mr. Thornton, my father worked his entire life for what he has. He built that house with his own hands. He doesn't owe Thomas a bailout for bad financial decisions, especially not at the cost of something so personally meaningful." Barbara Thornton's eyes narrowed. "And who exactly are you?" "I'm Laura, Donnie's daughter. And Thomas's sister. Barbara looked confused. Thomas didn't mention a sister was involved. That small revelation spoke volumes about how Thomas had presented the situation to his in-laws. The meeting deteriorated from there, with Richard making thinly veiled threats about prolonged legal action, Barbara questioning my motives, and Thomas looking increasingly desperate. Jessica remained silent throughout, her eyes fixed on the floor. After they left, Laura and I sat in stunned silence for several minutes. "Well," Laura finally said, "now we know why Thomas has been so desperate. His in-laws are terrifying." Despite the tension, I couldn't help but laugh. It was either that or cry. The strain began to show on everyone. Frank reported that Thomas had driven by the country house several times, once stopping to take photos of Eleanor working in the garden. Eleanor wasn't intimidated, but I worried about her being caught in the middle of our family drama. Meanwhile, my neighbors in Portland rallied around me. Betty from next door brought casseroles. John across the street offered to accompany me to legal meetings. My old work colleagues from the construction days showed up one Saturday to help with yard work, a show of solidarity that brought tears to my eyes. Through it all, I found myself thinking of Margaret. What would she have made of all this? Our son trying to sell our dream home out from under me, then attacking my mental competence when I outmaneuvered him. She would have been heartbroken, but I think she would have approved of my solution. Eleanor was breathing new life into our home, honoring its bones while adding her own chapter to its story. The legal battle took its toll on my health. My blood pressure rose, my sleep suffered, and I found myself losing weight from the stress. Laura noticed and insisted I see my doctor, who prescribed medication for anxiety and strongly suggested finding a way to resolve the family conflict. "Stress like this isn't good for a man your age," Dr. Patterson warned, "especially with your heart history." At my lawyer's suggestion, we agreed to a mediation session. Thomas, Jessica, Laura, and I met in a neutral conference room with a professional mediator. Harold attended as my counsel, while Thomas brought his own attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Diane who specialized in estate disputes. The mediation was a disaster from the start. Thomas refused to acknowledge that I had the right to sell my own property. Diane argued that as my only son, Thomas had a reasonable expectation of inheriting the country house. Harold countered with the simple fact that I was very much alive and entitled to manage my assets as I saw fit. "The money is in trust for the grandchildren's education," I repeated for what felt like the 100th time. "It's being put to good use, Thomas. Ashley and Michael will thank you for it someday. They need parents who aren't bankrupt more than they need college funds," Thomas shot back. Jessica, who had been silent for most of the meeting, suddenly spoke up. "This is pointless. He's not going to change his mind, Thomas. We need to figure out another solution." The frustration in her voice was palpable, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of sympathy for her. She was caught in a financial mess, partly of her own making, yes, but also trapped between her husband's anger and her parents' expectations. The mediation ended without resolution. As we were gathering our things to leave, Thomas turned to me, his voice low and wounded. "I never thought you'd choose a house over your own son." The words hit me like a physical blow. "And I never thought you'd choose a car over your parents' legacy," I replied sadly. 6 months passed. Winter turned to spring, and with it came changes none of us could have predicted. The court dismissed Thomas's petition, questioning my competence, citing the thorough medical evaluation and clear documentation of the legal sale. The judge was unimpressed by the argument that I should have consulted my adult son before selling my own property. With the legal avenue closed, Thomas seemed to deflate. Laura, who had been keeping tabs on family gossip, reported that Jessica had moved back in with her parents, taking the children with her. "Apparently the marriage has been on the rocks for years," Laura told me during one of our regular phone calls. The financial stress was just the final straw. I felt a complicated mixture of sadness for my son and grandchildren, and relief that the battle was finally over. The victory felt hollow knowing the pain it had caused, regardless of who was right. One rainy April afternoon, I was surprised by a knock at my door. Opening it, I found Thomas standing on my porch, looking older and more worn than I remembered. The expensive clothes and polished appearance were gone, replaced by jeans and a simple sweater. His eyes were red-rimmed, his shoulders slumped. "Can I come in, Dad?" he asked, his voice lacking the anger I'd grown accustomed to. I stepped aside, wordlessly inviting him in. We sat in the living room, the silence stretching between us until finally Thomas spoke. "Jessica filed for divorce last month," he said, staring at his hands. "Her father is covering the legal fees. They've agreed to take care of the kids while I, in their words, get my act together." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and meant it. Thomas nodded. "The thing is, they were right. I do need to get my act together. I've been seeing a financial counselor through a program at church. He's helped me see how out of control things have become." It was the last thing I had expected to hear. "That's a positive step," I offered cautiously. "I was wrong about the house, Dad," Thomas continued, his voice breaking slightly. "I got so caught up in the money problems, in trying to maintain the lifestyle Jessica expected, that I lost sight of what really mattered. I'm sorry." The apology hung in the air between us, fragile but sincere. I took a deep breath. "I appreciate that, Thomas. And I'm sorry, too, for the way things played out. I never wanted to hurt you." Thomas nodded again. "Laura told me about the trust for the kids. That was thoughtful of you. Their education is important. It's what your mother would have wanted," I said simply. We talked for hours that afternoon. Really talked. In a way we hadn't in years. Thomas shared the full extent of his financial troubles, the pressure he'd felt trying to keep up with Jessica's family's wealth, the bad investments, and mounting debt. I told him about my grief over selling the country house, but also about Eleanor and her art school plans. "Would you like to see what she's done with the place?" I asked impulsively. "Eleanor has invited me to visit any time. We could go together." Thomas hesitated, then nodded. "I think I'd like that, if you're sure she wouldn't mind." The following weekend, we drove out to the country house together. The 2-hour journey was awkward at first, but gradually we fell into easier conversation. Thomas told me about a job opportunity Laura had mentioned at her husband's park service office, a fresh start away from the financial industry. "It's entry-level, but honest work," he said, "and North Carolina would be a good place for a new beginning." When we arrived at the country house, I was struck again by how right it looked with Eleanor's touch. Flower beds bloomed where Margaret had once planted roses. A new sign near the barn read Hillside Art Retreat. Eleanor greeted us warmly, showing no sign of discomfort at meeting Thomas after their contentious introduction. She gave us a tour of the changes she'd made, all respectful of the house's character while adding her own artistic touch. The barn had been transformed into a bright studio space, where 5 or 6 students were working on paintings. The kitchen garden had been expanded, now including a small greenhouse. Inside, the house felt warm and lived in, with artwork on the walls and comfortable furniture arranged for conversation and creativity. "I've started weekend workshops for local children," Eleanor explained as we walked through the property, "and summer residencies for artists who need time and space to create." Thomas was quiet as we toured, but I could see him taking it all in. When we reached the back of the property, Eleanor pointed out a new addition that caught me by surprise. "I hope you don't mind," she said softly. "I created a memorial garden for Margaret. Some of the neighbors told me how much she loved gardening here." A small, peaceful area had been set aside, with a bench overlooking a garden of native plants. A simple stone marker read Margaret Crawford's garden. "May her spirit of creation continue to inspire." I felt tears well in my eyes. "It's perfect," I managed to say. "Thank you." Later, as Eleanor excused herself to check on her students, Thomas and I sat on the porch swing, just as Margaret and I had done countless times over the years. "She's taking good care of it," Thomas said finally. "Better than developers would have." "Yes," I agreed. "She Island. I miss Mom," Thomas said suddenly, his voice thick with emotion. "She would be so disappointed in me." "She would be sad about what happened," I acknowledged. "But she never stayed disappointed for long. She believed in second chances." On the drive back to Portland, Thomas asked if I would be willing to help him find a financial counselor, someone like the one I've been seeing through church, but maybe more experienced with investment recovery. "I'd be happy to," I told him, feeling the first real hope for our relationship in months. Recovery wasn't immediate or simple. Thomas and Jessica's divorce proceedings were difficult and drawn out. The grandchildren struggled with the changes, though they seemed relieved when the constant tension between their parents eased. Thomas took the job in North Carolina, moving into a small apartment near Laura and her family, starting over with humility I hadn't seen in him since he was young. I used some of the money from the house sale to start a community workshop program for veterans at the local community center, teaching basic carpentry skills, just as I had once taught Thomas. It felt like honoring Margaret's memory in a way she would have appreciated. Eleanor's art school flourished. She sent me regular updates and photos, keeping me connected to the house without the pain of what had been lost. Ashley and Michael began taking art classes there during summer visits, creating new memories in the house their grandmother had loved. A year after our confrontation, I visited the country house on what would have been Margaret's birthday. Eleanor had invited me to stay for the weekend, giving me the guest room that had once been our bedroom. Thomas joined me for the day, bringing a bouquet of Margaret's favorite flowers for the memorial garden. As we sat together on the bench Eleanor had placed there, watching the sunset over the hills, Thomas spoke quietly. "I think I understand now, Dad. Some things are worth more than money. This place, what you and Mom built, what it represented. I should have seen that." I placed my hand on his shoulder, feeling the weight of years of misunderstanding begin to lift. "We both made mistakes, son. The important thing is that we found our way back." Eleanor joined us later, bringing cups of hot cider as the evening cooled. We shared stories of Margaret, laughing at memories Thomas had of childhood adventures in the fields surrounding the house. For the first time in years, I felt Margaret's presence without pain, only gratitude for what we had created together. Life continues to unfold in unexpected ways. Thomas is slowly rebuilding his life and his relationship with his children. Eleanor's art retreat has become a beloved local institution. My suburban home feels more like home than it did before, filled with friends and purpose. The country house that once threatened to tear my family apart has, in its new incarnation, helped heal old wounds. It stands as a testament to the fact that sometimes letting go of something precious teaches us what we truly value. I often think about that difficult time and the lessons it taught all of us. Thomas learned about priorities and honest work. I learned about standing firm when necessary, but also about forgiveness. Eleanor found a new purpose. And Margaret's legacy lives on, not in ownership of property, but in the values and love we shared. What would you have done in my situation? Would you have fought to keep the house, sold it as I did, or given in to your child's demands? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories from my long journey through life. And if you know someone facing similar family challenges, share this video with them. Sometimes knowing we're not alone in our struggles is the greatest comfort of all. Thank you for listening, and remember, it's never too late to heal family wounds, even when they cut deeply.